All right, welcome everybody. This is a special episode of our Sightlines Premium channel. I'm going to be talking with the team, talking to each other. And that's sort of a reflection, I think, of what happened at the year end for us on Sightlines Premium as we decided to kind of take a look back as a team at some of the more interesting or surprising or kind of bonkers ways in which 2020 was shaped. And we didn't go back looking for novelty necessarily as to what happened in 2020. We were looking for really big shifts in the market that were accelerated that really indicate something about 2021 coming up, pandemic or otherwise. That I think people from Sightlines Premium members who are working across beer, wine, cider, seltzer, looking at premium beverage in general, things that they could be mindful of or see shifting in the market right now. Of course, our worldview always starts in beer, but very often ends up in other places and then looks back on itself again. And I think that was really reflected in the year-end challenge here of each of us kind of isolated two pieces or two trends or impacts or shifts in the market that we thought were uniquely interesting. And Bryan, I think in talking to you about what we would do at the end of the year, after all the people that we've talked to, all of the points we've tried to hammer home, in some cases multiple times, I think it became evident to you that there was probably a broad way to look at this. So tell us a little bit about what these 2 year-end emails were and what people, if they haven't read them yet, what they can expect going back and looking forward, why they should dig those out of their email inboxes and pull them up now.
Yeah, I think in you introducing what this idea was, the choice of the word accelerating is the key one there. And that's something in the same way that the idea of unprecedented became, as the word of 2020, acceleration is what happened in a lot of spaces, not just in beverage alcohol, but consumer packaged goods as well. And so the idea with these last 2 emails were to pick out a couple of ideas that really kind of struck each of us as not something that was just going to exist solely in the pandemic world of 2020 when so much was changing, but things that accelerated that were already happening because they were going to be taking place in 2021 regardless. Yeah. Which led us to the idea of this collection of 6 particular topics that, these are things that decision makers were looking at and making choices about in 2020. They will be taking place in 2021 and will continue to have great importance in the way that businesses are being run and the way that you think about portfolios and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny to be thinking about something like acceleration in a world where it seemed like everything had to stand still for a long time, right? Like those seem like opposing ideas. But Kate, even in your broader reporting through the Sightlines channel, I think a lot of the things that we ended up talking about, like retail experiences, what breweries are doing to adapt, a lot of these things, while they were forced by the pandemic, very much kind of opened the door into experiences that people were they kept kind of procrastinating and pushing out there a little bit further and not really kind of going after as an opportunity. And this kind of forced their hand in a lot of ways.
I didn't feel like there was very many things I reported about in terms of business stories this year that were brand new, whole cloth. We had never conceived of this before. Mostly it was, like you said, decisions people had been pushing off or sort of directions we knew the market was moving, but no one had to respond to yet. And then, yes, very quickly had to respond to those and develop systems, some of which were kind of new, but but not unforeseeable, I guess. Is how I would put it. And then a lot of issues, a lot of real challenges and struggles that breweries had this year, again, were not entirely new, but were exacerbations of, things that have been tripping them up for a while. So.
Yeah. I think the big flip that happened is that so much of what, especially smaller beverage companies and craft brewers in particular, were able to do for so long was prioritize maybe their own interests and desires onto the market because they were able to operate in a niche. They had control over all the sales channels. They were self-distributing or selling directly over their own bar. And that allowed them to sort of, remove themselves a little bit from the mean to which we always end up reverting in beer. And I think in this first piece, Bryan, that you wrote in part 1 of our year end, this was a piece that you returned to almost weekly over the course of the year, which was reminding a lot of these folks who maybe use words like, we brew the beers that we like to drink, that consumers really have the end when you're forced to go direct to consumer in a more conventional way, or you're forced to go through supermarket channels because that's the only thing that's open in the country anymore, or convenience stores become like a last-ditch effort to get some shelf space. You're encountering a world that has very long, well-established demands.
Yeah, and you stole the words from me a little bit there, because that's something that we talk about all the time. This idea of, we brew what we like to drink and we hope other people like it. Which is, there's some give and take there for sure. But I think what I found both in looking at IRI sales data, the objective side of things, as well as the subjective and anecdote from talking with people, wholesalers, producers, that the shift toward the easy to understand flavor experience made a really big push. And, in the first newsletter that we sent out, this idea of IPAs ruling all, this is something that existed, will continue to exist, and that's something that we cannot ignore or deny. But even still, there was one specific newsletter and podcast that we created for Sightlines Premium focusing on fruit beers, which I think has kind of acted in this periphery of a style or a flavor experience that was being made, but not in the explicit kind of way of being a successful piece of a portfolio where it's you're making a wheat beer or you're making a sour and let's throw some fruit on it. But what that does, especially what we saw in terms of 2020, was you're removing this barrier for people of what they assume that experience may be. So when they have, they're making fewer trips to a grocery store, they're allowing themselves less time to spend in that physical space. Like any kind of food or beverage option, removing guesswork from them is going to be a benefit to you. And so that's why we saw fruit beers actually, in terms of dollar sales growth in IRI channels, show the highest percentage, higher than IPAs, which of course makes way more dollar sales in terms of raw totals. But fruit beer was up about 36% in 2020 versus 2019. As comparison, IPA was about 21%. And when you have shoppers who are in this kind of mission-driven mindset, it really is thinking about the location, one, as well as what that product is going to be on the shelf, two, to make that step number three, actually grabbing it from the cold box, the least amount of mental work that somebody has to do.
Yeah, and I think even when we're talking about beers that are fruit driven, we're still talking about keeping it simple, stupid kind of moves, right? We're talking about making sure that the fruit is either visually depicted or the words are very prevalent and simple to understand. Introducing the nuances of a certain kind of orange or a certain kind of fruit, adds some interest maybe, but at some point you trip that scale and suddenly it seems complicated and nobody knows what it's going to taste like.
Yeah, it gets to the idea of you don't want to be too cutesy. And I know, 2018, 2019, there was certainly a continuous trend, and there still is, for the way that breweries want their label and artwork to represent an ethos, an idea. But, I think both in my own act of existing in these shopping spaces, as well as what I saw from data and looking at, say, the TTB, what labels are being approved, the understanding of making that explicit connection is not only more important in terms of making that sale happen, but it is also just a gradual shift in the recognition of the importance of that. So if you have blood orange in your IPA, put that on the label and, maybe have that orange there. If you are making a peach ale, having that peach on the label with the name can really remove, like I said, that barrier of decision-making. People know what those are. They know what to expect. And makes it easier to grab that can or bottle.
And a lot of that comes down to where and when people are willing to experiment, right? So if you're in a tap room, you're going to try a taste of something, even if it's a little outside of your comfort zone. When you're in the grocery store, there's so many factors pushing you to make a simple, efficient, confident decision, especially when you're buying a 6-pack. But speaking of, getting on consumers' terms, drinkers' terms, Kate, your first piece in here was really not just about their terms in terms of what they want to taste, but where they're willing to drink it. I think we've seen a trend in general for people drinking at home kind of growing over the years. But this year, talk about acceleration. For a while, people had no choice. What were you seeing here, both here and in the UK, where some of these trends were really accelerating?
Yeah, both here and in the UK, it's very clear that the long-term trend is towards off-premise consumption. And that's even really striking, especially in the UK, which has such a strong like pub culture. But we see it both there and in the US that just over decades, people are drinking more at home than they are on premise at restaurants and bars. So that 80-20 split between off-premise and on-premise, like, is gone. And yes, COVID is certainly, that's the reality we're living in now, is everything is at home. But I think it's short-sighted to think that we will have a complete flip back to dancing in the streets and drinking at bars for every single beer and going out to eat all the time. I think drinkers are establishing habits that are going to last, and that had precedent before the pandemic as well. So the number of on-premise establishments in the US, just objectively raw total, has been decreasing since 2001 pretty significantly, 20%. So, and then you add on top of that closures that will inevitably be permanent as a result of COVID, and there are just fewer reasons to go out, fewer places to drink on premise. And then add to that just the broader technological trends of what we have at our fingertips at home. So maybe 20 years ago, date night was go out to a brick and mortar movie theater, go out to a brick and mortar dinner, go to a bar for drinks after. All of that can kind of be accomplished at home now. You stream something, you order in on Seamless or DoorDash or what have you. You've got your beer delivered by a Drizzly or something like that, and that's your date night. And I think people are pretty comfortable with that. That doesn't feel weird or lazy or
and beer doesn't exist in a vacuum either, right? So I think we're seeing some really big long-term bets being placed by movie studios right now.
Mm-hmm.
That they're not just releasing things on streaming right now because of the pandemic. They're deciding that this is a major portion of their financial future. They're making huge deals and they're breaking records through streaming at home. And I don't, that's an indication that the larger context of things that we go out and consume as entertainment or, food and beverage is not going to exist in the same way that it did before. Certainly not anytime fast. I mean, I remember you lamenting over and over for weeks at the end of the year that you started to hear this mantra of it's going to be like repeal day. We're going to be, like you said, dancing in the streets. People are expecting everything to just snap back to normal. And I think even as though with the fundamentals of seeing the vaccine roll out, we're clearly in for a much more gradual return to any kind of normal. And that normal probably isn't going to be normal at all.
Mm-hmm. And add to that, a portion of people that will never be vaccinated for various reasons. We will probably just live with a low level of this virus, from what a lot of virologists are thinking, and a lot of public health officials are thinking, that this will always be a constant presence. And there will always be people who now are no longer comfortable going out, even, who knows, years in the future. So, when I was thinking about the movie theaters that you mentioned, Michael, I was also thinking about, oh my gosh, such a beer occasion, sports bars. Like we are streaming every sporting event now. We are watching it, maybe with a friend or two, like those occasions of like, meet me at
Buffalo Wild Wings.
Yeah. There will be people who go back to Buffalo Wild Wings, but we are establishing the at-home game day as well. Yeah.
I think to that point, I think Buffalo Wild Wings probably will be better off than most. I mean, we saw a general trend this year that larger retailers were doing relatively okay compared to small independent retailers. And that's largely because of both the products that are there, the audience that appeals to, and who's willing to operate and can do so safely, both, from a financial perspective and a staffing perspective. With most of the reports that we saw of people having large crowds in their businesses, crowds associated with 2020, these were places where you expect Bud Light to maybe be the most popular beer at that place, right? Like these are not places that are community-based, independent retailers, independent breweries, or beverage companies. Like those places were very, very much scaled back, by and large, on average. And so I think when we do talk about a return, I think the slowest part of that return is probably going to be in the long tail. And that's really dangerous for a lot of those smaller independent businesses. And that kind of brings me to the first point I wanted to talk about here, from part one of our email, was the big squeeze. Because, I mean, talking about distribution companies, I mean, again, to kind of connect that back to what's happening with movie studios, I mean, beer wholesalers are fundamentally kind of in a similar position here. And they're very much looking at the grocery store as, it's always been a bit of a bloodbath there, but this is going to be the year when you're going to fight for what you can get, because it's going to keep, after this, it shrinks again. And has a lot to do with the shelf space that's disappearing from hard seltzer right now, eating into beer's category. It has to do with how poorly beer as a category is performing overall right now, which is if you remove FMBs from the all beer kind of tracking of IRI, it is not a pretty picture for beer right now. Craft is outperforming that, which is a small sort of win there, but how long lasting that is really questionable right now, I think. But boy, coming from a market like Chicago, where I am, the consolidation we saw. So this is during a time in the pandemic when we saw, huge distributors laying off almost their entire on-premise sales staff at some point, because they had to. I mean, a lot of them kept them on for a while and repurposed them, but eventually had to let them go. But that doesn't necessarily indicate a long-term financial risk for them. That's more of a short-term stopgap, because during that time they went on a buying spree. And we saw the most consolidation in the past year in the wholesaling tier that we've seen in a generation. And in Chicago, just to give you a picture of what that looks like, Chicago used to be one of the more diversely distributed markets in the country, especially for a large metropolitan area. We had decent sized independent retailers like Breakthrough, which was formerly Wirtz, and we had Windy City, which got bought by Reyes but operated independently to some degree, and that got consumed and sort of consolidated this year. We now are a city that has a red house and a blue house, and that's kind of insane to me, that your only real path to market as a small up and coming brewery in Chicago, if you're not going to go with one guy with a few vans, is to go with a red or a blue house. And for as long as I've been living in Chicago, for about 17 years now, and drinking beer here, that has not been the case. That's a fundamental realignment of this market. And I think that indicates a lot of what we've seen happening over the last few years in other markets, and it's continuing. And that means that you have very hugely competitive brands, sometimes in the same house, in the same portfolio. And it's going to be a real fight to get that shrinking shelf space, especially in grocery stores, as the pandemic has basically made that the only realistic, scalable path to market for a lot of these brands. And if you're not in those shelf sets now, you're kind of going to be left out of the conversation in 2021 in a pretty big way.
Should we talk about California, Kate? What that looks like?
The country, to me, in terms of distributors, looks like this risk board, and there's Reyes in California just eating away at the rest of it. I always lost at risk, so I'm not going to take that metaphor any further. But yeah, the Reyes juggernaut in California just grabbing up these just entire geographies, entire territories, is pretty remarkable to watch. And I am certainly not expecting to not write about Reyes in 2021. So
yeah, I remember it was one of the first stories that we had on Reyes in California in 2020. We had several of them on Sightlines. Where we actually included a link to a map that we had created that showed the locations of Reyes wholesalers, which just created a blanket right down north to south, not only just in major metro centers, but little kind of HQs along the way. And I think to what you're talking about, Michael, what's happening in California acts as this kind of maybe forewarning of sorts. We knew about consolidation already, like so many other things that just sped up in 2020. But what's taking place there and what's happening in Chicago is a great example of the way that, as things change with getting your product to market, these are the rapidly changing things that you have to keep in mind as a business owner and decision maker, because they happen so quickly, and we're talking about large companies that hold a lot of power and sway.
Absolutely. And I think the upside of some of that is I think it's going to push a lot of smaller producers into these emerging channels like direct to consumer, selling through Instagram and e-commerce. Any local independent retailers you can get into and build a relationship with are probably going to continue to be very fruitful for you. But I think, anytime there's opportunity at the small sort of long tail level, it means that gap you have to jump to get from there into something like regional just becomes wider and wider and wider with consolidation like this. So, most producers, I think, were probably hearing the message early in the year that you've got to get into grocery, you've got to get into mass chain retail, because otherwise your 2020 is going to be a big fat zero. And I think for a lot of people that was probably true, and they hustled to get in there. But I think the downside to that is that channel became so focused and so constrained with so much noise now, with everybody having to go through the same funnel, that 2021's shelf sets in the spring are going to open up with a lot of brands missing. Because there's simply not space for them long term. And so if you were looking at that as a stopgap and you were hoping to return to your normal business in 2021, I hope that put you in a position to do that. But if you were looking at that as like, hey, great, we're in a Whole Foods now, that means that that'll be incremental growth for 2021. Like you might not be there if you haven't secured that place going forward, because there's more pressure there than ever before. Yeah. Speaking of e-commerce, Bryan, that was in part 2 of our email. That was where you let off.
Yeah. I kind of wink at this in the newsletter. I could list off a dozen different data points about why this is a big deal and why it's important. So I hate to say, just go read the thing. But the big thing is e-commerce over-indexed in IRI channels for the entirety of the year, running about twice as high as brick and mortar locations. If you want to talk about the demographics of who's doing it, this is skewing toward younger people who find it more important and more convenient. One of the points was, Kroger is the first full-scale grocery chain that in 2020 was able to break into the top 10 in e-commerce. This is, of course, with big names like Amazon and Walmart. There's basically no reason not to explore this space. It's really only a question of how you want to do it. And so we had examples in Sightlines this past year about doing it successfully through social media, for example, which could be done through Facebook and Instagram, a literal click to get to a shop scenario. Even here in North Carolina, where I am, I was getting ads for out-of-state breweries for their online shopping options, just because they recognize the importance of it, and Facebook's feeding it to me.
We also saw Instagram make a big shift in their user experience this year towards shopping. I mean, what we all thought Pinterest was going to become, and it largely did, which was sort of a browsing and shopping experience, kind of masquerading with a social media front end. Instagram pulled that trigger in a big way this year at exactly the right time for a lot of these smaller brands who had no other path to market.
Yeah, and one of the things we often talk about, I think, is looking outside of beer, beverage alcohol for inspiration, and the way that something like fashion has really grabbed hold of that aspect on Instagram, for example, which is a very visual thing when you're talking about the clothes that we wear. But putting whether it's a skirt or a shirt or a beer, putting it in context of what that flavor is, the kind of experience that you might suggest someone to have with it. All of a sudden, again, we're talking about removing these barriers of experience and expectations. So it's not just easy for someone to come across that photo of your new release and understand what it might be in terms of what they might taste and experience, but all of a sudden you also have control to suggest about the way they might consume it or when and how to. And so, again, it's impossible to ignore the impact that e-commerce has had. And it's really just whether it's setting up a shop on your website, utilizing social media. There are many ways to do it. You just need to pick the right one.
Yeah. A lot of that, I think, was almost foreshadowed by what was happening. And we didn't talk about non-alcoholic in here really, but I think the e-commerce side of non-alcoholic with brands like Athletic Brewing Company really going hard into the direct-to-consumer Instagram e-commerce space. I think maybe indicated a possible future for some of these brands if and when the laws allow. And this year we saw a lot of that gray area really emerging as opportunity for these brands. I mean, thinking also about how people buy things and if you're going through an e-commerce experience, whether that's something interesting and new, like an Instagram shopping experience, or something fairly traditional, like shopping at a Mariano's or a Jewel Osco or a Bevmo or something like that, but you're doing it through an e-commerce, it's going to change your buying habits, right? You're going to be buying different brands and different formats and different volumes. And Kate, that's where you wanted to focus for your part two story here, was talking about things scaling up in terms of package size.
Yeah, I think anyone who has paid attention to anything in beer this year knows that large format packets were winners during COVID as people were stocking up, which was certainly true in the sort of like stockpiling phase, but then really did continue to be a preference after that. In the months where things were opening up again, people were still interested in those large format packs. And what was really interesting was how well craft performed in that space, growing ahead of all beer in those either 12, 15, 18 packs, especially in the 18-pack 12-ounce cans. Craft was killing it. And maybe that's because those options hadn't been available previously. So there was just growth naturally by more products being offered in that space. But I think, so that's probably the most visible packaging trend. But I think what else was happening was really smart, nimble breweries offering different packaging sizes tailored to the channels in which they would sell. So what I buy beer-wise in a convenience store is totally different, obviously, from what I'm buying at a grocery store. Maybe not even, maybe brand-wise, but also in terms of its format. I'm not probably buying the same size at a convenience store as I'm buying at Costco. And smart breweries were those who were able to tailor packaging to those spaces. So in this wrap-up end-of-year article, we use Allagash as a really good example. They debuted 12 packs of 12-ounce cans of white right before the pandemic hit. That was supposed to be a slow rollout. It was like, let's pour gasoline on that, obviously. Distributors didn't mind adding it because retailers were looking for it, customers were looking for it. But then also some kind of like funkier, maybe less intuitive packages that did well for white. 19-2s, which were a convenience store play, the brewery was telling me did very well with like takeout restaurant orders, which totally makes sense. That's either something, a 19-2 is something I could share to have a little splash with someone else as we're sharing a meal, or that's like a really nice single serve package for me as I'm eating dinner.
And that's an occasion that, a lot of craft brewers and Allagash in particular just weren't, part of the consideration set for prior.
Mm-hmm. And that might have been a little bit of a happy accident, but it totally illustrates a way that you can find a toehold, again, with people drinking more off premise. You can offer them the packaging size that feels like just the puzzle piece fitting into that occasion. So the more options you have for those package sizes, the more places you can play in, but then you come up against, can't have 1,000 SKUs in your in your portfolio anymore. So I think there's a very nimble, a very delicate dance to be had there. But if you can do it right, you can really succeed at it.
And I think one of the things you and I talked about was comparing it to, like, this is basically what Budweiser, and large mass domestics in general have always tried to achieve, is we've got the format on the shelf in the right place at the right time. But a lot of that is about blocking, right? A lot of that is about offering distinct SKUs for a buyer at a mass chain retail location to convince them to put another Budweiser format on the shelf and extend that shelf set. And really, a lot of that is a defense tactic, and it's really just trying to expand the inches that you occupy in sort of a defensive way. But what's happening for craft brewers, at least at this early stage, is that this is really about meeting consumers where they're at and showing up in places you just didn't show up before and being a part of that consideration set. So while it might start to mimic the end result visually of what's happened with larger brands, where those show up is actually fundamentally different, and for different reasons in a lot of ways, even if it's attracting a similar consumer, which is exciting. The convenience store was really interesting. We didn't really dig into it in specifics in our year end, Bryan, but I think that was one of the more predictive pieces that we put together early on in the pandemic. Was like, as these lockdowns start to scale back and open up again, people are going to be on the road, and there's not going to be very many places that they feel safe going into, and convenience stores is going to be one of them. People should be paying attention to that space. And And that was one of the more prescient pieces that I think we wrote this year that really indicated a growth opportunity for small beverage companies.
Yeah, I was looking at those IRI numbers end of 2019 into 2020. And the C-store space is one that's always really had me curious, just because it seemed like this white space that was out of the reach of a lot of smaller beverage alcohol makers, just because it wasn't a place that they played in before. But everything's just screaming to me. There's, like 3 craft breweries who are in there. You have a growing audience, whether it's by just travel or aspects of urbanization. And so we had this 3-part series, I think it was in March, talking about what was next to come with convenience, just as things were kind of bottoming out for sales because people were literally in lockdown in some places.
Yeah.
And then convenience just took off, and it was outpacing a lot of other retail outlets for the second half of the year.
Yeah. And I think there's so many baked in assumptions that I think you're kind of hinting at that kept, smaller beverage companies from exploring that space for a while. The assumption that it's highly corporate, that it's got to be cheap, that your margins are thin, some of which can be true depending on who you're talking about and where. But I think the counterintuitive quality of it is that this is actually a very premiumized space. Yeah. Prices tend to be higher, and consumers are paying, they're paying a higher absolute cost for a single serving of something oftenly, but their overall spend in the store might be lower than it would be at a grocery store. So it's kind of exchanging one set of circumstances for another in a way that actually kind of favors some producers who can get into a predictable place, of being a good supplier to a corporate driven environment like a 7-Eleven. And we have people like Colin McDonald at Hen House who have explored that space and kind of opened up those doors in a way that it felt a little bit like a big dumb aha to a lot of people who were listening to those conversations and following along on the convenience package that we put together, that this is a space that we had, that small producers have every right and actually have an advantage in playing in, because the main, the craft beer drinker or the craft cocktail, RTD drinker is a mainstream consumer at this point, and those people are looking for those options every time they walk into a store, whether it's a small bottle shop or a Binny's and a Bevmo or a 7-Eleven. They expect those brands to be showing up there, and when they don't, there's a moment of disappointment. That's a missed occasion.
Here's something to think about, which we did not have in that original series, that has been in my mind lately, because when we talk about convenience, but even now in grocery, the 19.2s that Kate is talking about have been really, really successful. And we were talking about 19.2 ounces, which is 3 less than the dead bomber, just running away. So it's not even a case of us worrying about, this is too much beverage. This is too much liquid in this container, because what we're talking about is ultimately negligible. And what we are talking about in this case is location and branding and opportunity. Yeah. And so where the 22-ounce bomber has gone the way of the dodo, we now see just the simple change in packaging and location really opening up opportunities.
It's all about the cans.
I think where else the 19.2s in convenience are really cool is as people are stocking larger formats, making decisions more quickly, those cans are an amazing place for trial. Like, I'm not going to roll the dice on a 15-pack from a brewery I haven't had or of a brand I haven't had. But yeah, for $3, the 19.2 is a great place to become acquainted with a new brand that then, hey, that was great. Yeah, all right, I will upgrade to that 12-pack next time. So where there are with the on-premise closed, with so many fewer options for trial, I think that's a place that you can still be doing that effectively.
Yeah, and that was something that Lagunitas talked to us about in those newsletters too. The fact that the reason why they were shifting so much toward convenience. And if you look at some of their bigger brands, IPA, 12th of Never, for example, just shot up in share of dollars spent at convenience stores. And it was specifically cited for that reason, that they saw as if you've set a $2.99 price point as kind of the commonly accepted one, that's a real easy get for someone who maybe hasn't tried your product before, but are interested in your brand, and that's really not a huge investment.
Absolutely. I mean, and the last piece that I wrote in part 2 here was really about the takeover of cans almost being complete at this point. Talk about acceleration. I mean, there's been a long growth trend of cans versus bottles for a long time, but I don't think any of us ever expected cans to so quickly take over. Not just the narrative, which it had for a while, but really looking at the numbers of what cans were doing. But the pandemic accelerated it to such a degree that so many producers who were, that had their own tap room were draft only, or they were mostly draft. They had to get into package in order to have a product to sell in the earliest part of 2020 due to lockdowns for the most part, due to restrictions on sales channels and some of that consolidation. So that insane demand coupled with what's happening in hard seltzer and the meteoric growth that's continuing of not only the category, but some of its top players like Truly and White Claw continuing to find plenty of runway. The burden that got put on aluminum just as a raw material and then cans as a finished product coming from places like Ball was unbelievable. It almost shut down some people's entire path to market, not being able to get cans. I mean, the amount of text messages and Facebook messages going back and forth between producers just trying to find a vessel to put their product in was astounding. And I mean, we saw people, just to show you how extreme it got, we saw some people putting them in like plastic pop bottles just to get things into market because it was that constrained. I think what that did was, it didn't necessarily eliminate glass from the conversation. I don't think that'll ever be the case. It'll always have a pretty significant percentage of sales in our country just because of how we operate and who buys beer and for what occasions. Glass is always going to be very relevant. But I think it sealed in the aluminum cans sort of, I guess if we thought it was ever going to get to a 50-50 market, we got there, and it's going to be locked in for a long time, if not continue to trickle away and chip away at Glass's lead there. We do know that, Ball is certainly looking at the future of aluminum in this country, not specifically because of beer, but because of this rush to RTDs going into the market, canned cocktails, everything is going to be ready to drink in the near future. And that has as much to do with hard seltzer and beer as it does any other space that's trying to get onto a shelf now. And they're building, I think it was 3 plants that they're planning to build to start satisfying demand, maybe by the end of 2021 if we're lucky. But we're probably going to see a restriction on the availability of cans for the rest of 2021 as a result of what the pandemic has pushed people into the market and the way they've pushed them into the market with packaged goods for the first time. Those people aren't going to be able to just stop running cans. That's going to be, if anything, they're going to be hoping that continues to be incremental volume and sales for them. I don't think anybody's looking to turn off that investment as fast as possible. I think they're hoping to hold on to that, but getting a hold of aluminum is going to be priority number 1 to make that even possible.
Yeah, I want to put that in context too, because if you remember, both of you probably in 2018, like me, were getting a barrage of email news releases about such and such brand is now in cans. And just think about, 2 years later, of all the things that have absolutely happened in the world, now the expectation is that that new brand will be in a can, and that's both from the consumer and the producer side as well. Yeah. That is just like the huge exclamation point on how far we've come.
Yeah. And I think if we're going towards this future where there are fewer channels, a lot of it's happening on e-commerce, that stuff showing up at your door. I think that builds the expectation that cans are just this perfect vessel to facilitate so much of that. The other day, as a user of one here, I ordered a 12-pack of Sierra Nevada and it showed up in bottles, and I was shocked. I was shocked that was what somebody picked up off the shelf, because I tend to get groceries through Instacart, and that means that a person picked up a box of 12 bottles and decided, like, this makes sense, and put that in a cart. Whereas if you have that option versus cans, like that, the cans are just going to be so much more lighter. They're not going to clink around and feel like this broken thing. And you're not going to carry all that weight from the grocery store to your car to the door. And then me carrying it up to the kitchen and through the house. Like, there's just a lot of, I don't know, bottles are just so extra in that way that I'm shocked that was the decision that somebody made. And it's also the first time I think I've had bottles in my fridge for a long time that weren't wine or cider bottles.
And you can't put them in that nice little can slot in the mini fridge.
That's right.
So that's weird.
So, I mean, all of the things we've talked about today really hint at what, things that I think are going to be hanging over in 2021, if not continuing to accelerate. These are things that I think are inescapable factors for beverage producers, especially on the smaller side in the long tail going into the new year. And I hope people are being very mindful of that. We're going to continue to try and help them be mindful of these things. People should, if you're interested, if you haven't seen these emails and you're part of our subscriber community, dig them up in your inbox. They're there. They're waiting for you. It's highly relevant to any decisions you're making right now, I assure you. And if you're not a subscriber and you're seeing this, go to goodbeerhunting.com/sightlines. That's where you'll find the sign up. That's where you'll find the pitch for what the community is and what the newsletter is and what's coming up in 2021. And these are the people. Bryan, Roth, Bernot, and myself are the people who produce these insights and try to make them as actionable as possible using both data, but also some, just ongoing insight that we're deriving from the market as we continue to pay attention to it and talk to producers. And the community part of it, the Slack channel and the video chats that we do with people is where we get a lot of the richness behind some of those insights that we're developing kind of from a slight distance. That's how we get inside of people's heads and how they're thinking about things, both strategically, but also sometimes emotionally. Some of the things that we're talking about right now are not simple decisions to make just because that's where the numbers say to go. Some of these things challenge somebody's idea of who they are as a producer and the ethos of their brewery and what kind of brand they want to be in the market. And resolving that tension is usually the hardest part. And that's what we're there for, is for those conversations. Bryan, looking into 2021, you were kind of reflecting back, I think, on the purpose of Sightlines. And you were interested in sort of pulling back the curtain a little bit on not just the intent, but also why that intent for Sightlines has such energy behind it sometimes. Like it's a little bit of there's a little bit of like cage rattling on occasion, because so much of what happens in reporting around, and not just from mainstream media, but even within the industry, trade magazines writing about beer and small producers of lots of other beverages is so narrative driven. And we see the copy pasta of headlines across the industry about things like lager is going to be the next big thing. And so much of what we wanted to do with Sightlines was pull those narratives out of the way so that we could look at what's actually happening and make better decisions. And what you wanted to write about to kind of kick off 2021 was really driven towards, now we have a year of evidence behind us of exactly what we wanted to bring to people and why we think it's valuable. And it's proving to be exceptionally true. Tell us a little bit about what that is for you, what that instinct is, and how it's going to show up in 2021.
Yeah, storytelling, no surprise, very powerful way to get people to learn, experience, and ultimately buy into the things that you're talking about. And I think the original intent of what we were doing with the newsletter, which absolutely came to life, was using this strategy of both data-driven insights, but also anecdote that shows real-world applications. Which, to be completely honest, like I'm not blowing smoke up our own here. Like you're not going to find this specific kind of combination in other places. With the data that we have available to us, the way we look at it, and then the way that we bring these stories to life by reaching out to people in the community. These are actionable items that not only are we writing about ahead of time, before and while they were happening, but they do give this kind of foresight that will hopefully help people make decisions that make a difference.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot this past week thinking about this piece of duality where, with everything that's happened in 2020 related to the way that we interact with the retail world, the simplicity of things, perhaps, whether we're talking about the amount of time we spend in a grocery store, or if we're just looking to buy that easy to understand fruit beer, I don't want there to be this thought process of that is making things dumber or lazier or simpler. It's just things are different. Things are really different now. And where we were at the beginning of this conversation talking about accelerants, the way that we look at consumers, given the vast options that they have, they are not lazy or they're not looking for something simple. they just have been exposed to so many different things, and the world is so different that I think the way that we look at these stories and the way that we try to bring these pieces of data to life can really make a difference.
Yeah, I think the two things there that you really hit on that resonate with me is that this is content for decision makers, right? This is not content for people who want to sort of like loosely abstractly think about a space. Like if you are somebody who is tasked with making smart decisions consistently in your company, this is information that helps you do that well and helps you do it well repeatedly. The other part there I think that's important is we're not trying to dumb things down. We're not trying to get everybody to kind of funnel down into the same kind of decision. In most cases, I think the information doesn't necessarily tell you what the right answer is. It helps you be more intellectually honest about the choice you're going to make regardless. So, I think that the flavor thing you're talking about is really important because there's a lot of people out there that are interested in the complexity of flavor and they're interested in talking about it in a way that is somewhat complex. And I think that kind of information just helps you know what you're up against, that you're not up against trying to impress people with what it tastes like. Your real challenge in that scenario is to help communicate it efficiently for them so that they don't just, so that they're at least willing to give it a chance to begin with. And if you're a decision maker, that helps you understand where you're going to invest your time and energy. It's got to be in awareness or education or in that, that few seconds you have at the shelf to communicate what that is. It's going to help you position that product better to have a better chance at success, even if you're not willing to compromise on what's going into that container in the first place. And that's the kind of insight. Like I try to tell people, I'm not trying to get you to make a different decision. I'm trying to get you to know that you're going to do it anyway. That there's that there's going to be some work involved in doing it anyway. But doing it anyway is where so much of the valuable innovation and richness of the beverage market comes from. And people who know what they're up against are in a position to do it really well and create a future for other people to do that kind of thing really well at the same time. And I just think those are better decisions. They're more resilient. They're smarter. They're more aware. It's not about trying to dumb things down for the consumer. It's about not letting people dumb down what their decision entails, and really be as smart about that as you can.
Yeah, one of the first posts we had in 2020 was basically looking at the direct line of how we ended up in the space of hard seltzers becoming such a big deal. It literally started with me talking about tap water. The way that people consume tap water, which begat ways that people consume packaged water, which leads to hard seltzer. And the way that we can look at all of these things in a direct chronological line and see where they match up, and exactly what you're talking about, Michael, is that these things were going to happen, but the context and background that we're providing not only explains why and why it may be inevitable, but the way that you can look at it as someone who's making these things to be the most efficient and effective at doing it.
That's right. And going into 2021, Kate, we've been talking about the absolute depth of content that you've produced on the freemium side of Sightlines. We're going to be bringing you further into Sightlines Premium as we start to mine some of those insights and especially those anecdotal examples and stories that are coming from brewers in a very real world application way. I think that's going to be a layer that really shows up in our reporting this coming year in Sightlines Premium, that really just helps tie those things together in a more, an increasingly substantial way, which is aided by the network growing. I mean, we now have people inside of Sightlines. We have the entire company of Boston Beer. We have the entire company of New Belgium. People are starting to sign up in ways that are bringing their entire company into that insights and decision-making realm. And I think that's just going to give us so much more insight into product development, pipelines, how people are thinking about spaces, because a lot of these people are certainly very realistically guarded about what they're working on, but they also have a need to understand how other people are thinking about spaces. And as that network grows, and we're able to report on the larger world of those things happening, your role there is going to be so important to this. I'm really excited about that. I mean, I'm thinking back to the piece that you did about COVID implications for how people design their spaces and how they're making things healthy. So much of that involved stitching together not just authoritative information from the CDC and issuing guidelines. It came down to how are some of these producers making these decisions on the ground right now, and how is that producing results for them and their customers? That's the piece that I'm really excited about you bringing. Can you, before we sign off today, can you tell us just for a moment about what that kind of reporting entails? Like what goes into being able to connect those dots between abstract insight to real world examples. Like, how do you pull that out of people?
Who doesn't love a case study? Is kind of how I approach those. Is like, okay, we know the meta trends or forces that are acting on a scenario. Where do those forces show up in this geographic space? And so I think you have to, my process of reporting is sort of always keeping those forces in mind and seeing where I find them in a certain space. But it's also listening to what the motivations are that are driving the decisions when I'm talking to folks. So it's like, what is top of their mind that's causing them, not just what is the action, but what is behind this action? What's the driving factor here? Is it, in the COVID sort of scenario, it's, is it safety in this kind of sense? Is it communicating that safety to customers? Like, what are the motivations? And then that's, I think, where you can tell the really big story. Is not just what is happening, but why are we making the decisions that we're making? And if those forces and motivations were to change, what would that mean? So that's there'll be plenty more of that ahead for sure this year, because we are certainly not in a clear place by any means going into this year, to say the least. So I only expect to further dig into those larger anxieties and concerns and how they play out tangibly in this.
Yep. Well, I can tell you that this past year being sort of an experiment for us at Good Beer Hunting as to whether there was an audience for this kind of insight, whether people did really want to dig into that. We certainly had a hunch that they would. It required us to go through a little bit of a process of framing it and refining that framing and connecting with people and networking and getting them to see what the possibilities were. I think it's been a hugely successful year for us in terms of refining that product, optimizing it for people, getting it into their hands in the best way possible. And this year, exploring audio like we do so well. These video chats are becoming increasingly important for people. Just provides so much context, and then all of it built on the backbone of that data, insight, and actionable decision making newsletter that we put out on a weekly basis, and increasingly sometimes twice a week. It's proven to be so effective for so many people that I think we're going into 2021 in a pretty exciting place. I'm excited to grow that. So I really appreciate everything you guys have done this year on both sides of the Sightlines product. I think it's going to be increasingly important for the industry overall.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys. I'll talk to you soon.